I'm Colin Green, and you are listening to Spike Pit, a rockin' RPG podcast. Strap in and enjoy the ride. For some time, basically since discovering this idea of the old school, new school divide, I've kind of convinced myself that really it's all just D&D. And I'm wondering, is there any substance to that? I've gone back to the books and looked at the broad brushstrokes that designers have used to explain what D&D is. And now I feel I want to mess about with my own fusion and try and come up with this, I guess some people would call it the Fantasy Heartbreaker, a D&D spin on the Fantasy Heartbreaker. For me, as I said in a previous episode, I really like the heart of 5th edition, but not so much some of the stuff that gets piled up on top of that. I also enjoy the old game. A lot of that is just ingrained in the way I run a game. I don't think it would be a particularly difficult exercise to take something, let's say the basic rules for the current edition, take out the things I don't like, and maybe use some ideas from the Dungeon Master's optional rules, the toolkit that comes in Chapter 9 of the DMG. And the way I'm tackling this is basically just going through a PDF, striking out stuff, and making notes about things that I want to include. The core of this engine is the D20 resolution mechanism, and that is tied up with ability scores currently covered under Chapter 7, and I've shared that chapter with listeners because for me, I think that's going to be the foundation. That's going to be my starting point and build everything away from that.
Hey Colin, it's BJ. I just listening to your newest episode on ability scores, and I think you're heading towards something that it's kind of a pet peeve of mine when people talk about how 5th edition works. They forget that you never make skill checks in 5th edition. You make ability checks, and the abilities are what are central to everything that happens in the core mechanic of 5th edition. Now, if you happen to have proficiency in a skill that will help out when you make that ability check, then you get to add it in. But you're always making ability checks, which is why all the other characters in the party can try to stealth or force open a door or listen for a noise or anything like that, even if they don't have training in one of the skills, they don't have proficiency in one of the skills that we normally associate with that. And while mathematically that may not seem like it means much, whether you call it a skill check or an ability check, it's still the same numbers that you add up and tack onto your roll. Conceptually, theoretically, if you're understanding that 5th edition is a game where you make ability checks and you may have skills that enhance that, and that all adventurers make ability checks, I think that does make it in some ways more similar to original D&D. Now, there are a lot of things going on in 5th edition that make it different from original D&D, but I think in that sense, it was intended to be more back to an ability check system and not a skill system, but they kept a skill system tacked on, and because some people are so used to doing it the way it was done in 3rd edition, 4th edition, Pathfinder, they just see those skills and they out of habit or just what they've learned, that's what. And so I've kind of wondered sometimes if the design of the basic default character sheet that you see in the very back of the player's handbook for 5th edition, if they didn't list the skills, if they just had a section where you had to write in which skills you were proficient with, and the only things you thought of as skills were, okay, I got a stealth +2, I got a investigation +2, and then you would have to sort of think about, well, now where do I tack this on with which ability checks do I tack this on? Just the psychological process of not having that long list of skills to look at. So the DM is always calling for an ability check, and you as a player are kind of managing, okay, when the DM calls for ability check, I'm always going to look at my list of proficiencies and figure out if I got a proficiency that might apply in the situation. I wonder if that would have changed the conversation we've been having about 5th edition over the last several years. Anyway, great episode. Oh, hey, Colin, one other thing real quick. I just was thinking about the messages I just left. When I said I got a pet peeve about where people talk about 5e and they forget that we're making ability checks, not skill checks. I wasn't directing that at you. I was actually think you're starting to, in discussing how they explain ability checks, you're starting to highlight that it's really about the ability checks. I didn't want you to think I was accusing you of doing that. No, I think you're highlighting a very important key aspect to understanding 5th edition. So just wanted to clarify that up in case there was any confusion.
Now, I wasn't going to have any calls in this show when I originally put it together, but since I've been talking about this subject, there has been call-ins. I'm going to do another call-in show in the near future, but these two calls, one from BJ and one from Jason Connolly, coming up next, are so appropriate to this episode I thought it'd be silly not to put them in. BJ the Arcane Alienist, that's his podcast, check it out, shining a little bit of light on something that I've seen time and time again, and I do think it is a confusion caused from the 3rd edition, 3.5, 4th edition, and that is this idea of skills, and it seems to have got a little bit lost in the shuffle that 5th edition is kind of harking back to some earlier ideas in the game. And well put, BJ. Now the next caller, like I say, Jason, has called in, and he's talking about some ability variants. Well, he's talking about a different game entirely, but I want to come on to some ability variants I've hinted at before. So let's hear what Jason's going to say. Then I'll move on to another reading, and then that'll be that. So big thanks to the callers. Over to Jason.
Hey Colin, Jason here. Great job reading there on your latest episode when you talk about Chapter 7, the attributes, and it's good to know where you're coming from in your 5e hack. So, no arguments, no problems, no issues, and like you say, knowing where we're coming from, that you're coming from the world of 5e D&D, and that's what we're working with is important, and knowing the definitions is important. So I am with you 100%, and it makes sense from what you described. It's not my preferred version, because I prefer just to roll under the attribute as opposed to the D20 plus the modifier, but that's neither here nor there. I will say, if we're going to go the 5e D&D route, like everything you just described, so we're using DCs, and we're adding the attribute bonus to a D20 roll, plus all the other stuff you talked about, which seems overly complicated. But one thing I would change personally is I would move influencing an animal over to charisma, and then I didn't hear where like a horror check would be, or a sanity check or something like that, because I guess normal D&D characters don't get scared. But I would also put that under charisma, because I kind of think charisma probably gets left out more so than wisdom. Wisdom with perception all probably gets overused, at least in the games I run, they do. By the way, I think the Black Hack version of just rolling under the attribute for everything, and I guess arguably you do that with BX or whatever, is maybe a little too simplified. I'm not a fan of skill systems as detailed as what you have here, but I do like having some kind of skill ideas, which is why I kind of like Barbarians Lemuria a lot, because you have those careers, and those careers cover that broad range of skills. And then if I was going to do it in a system like this, it'd be roll under the attribute for the save, like the Black Hack, and then your careers would determine the skills you have. But like I say, now that I know where you're going with your definitions that you've given us, being on the same sheet of music is pretty awesome. So I'm looking forward to your next episode, and I am fully on board with you.
Next thing I want to tackle is some of these variations to core Chapter 7 And that's what I'm going to talk about and include in a reading now from the DMG. This starts with some guidance on approaching the hacking of rules, then talks about proficiency bonuses and skill variant rules, of which there are 3 different systems, and I will detail them in the reading. Chapter 9, Dungeon Master's Workshop. As the Dungeon Master, you aren't limited by the rules in Player's Handbook, the guidelines in this book, or the selection of monsters in the Monster Manual. You can let your imagination run wild. This chapter contains optional rules you can use to customize your campaign, as well as guidelines on creating your own material, such as monsters and magic items. The options in this chapter relate to many different parts of the game. Some of them are variants of rules and others are entirely new rules. Each option represents a different genre, style of play or both. Consider trying no more than 1 or 2 of the options at a time so that you can clearly assess their effects on your campaign before adding other options. Before you add a new rule to your campaign, ask yourself 2 questions. Will the rule improve the game? Will my players like it? If you're confident that the answer to both questions is yes, then you have nothing to lose by giving it a try. Urge your players to provide feedback. If the rule or game element isn't functioning as you intended or isn't adding much to your game, you can refine it or ditch it. No matter what a rule source, a rule serves you, not the other way around. Beware of adding anything to your game that allows a character to concentrate on more than one effect at a time, use more than one reaction or bonus action per round, or attune to more than 3 magic items at a time. Rules and game elements that override the rules for concentration, reactions, bonus actions, and magic item attunement can seriously unbalance or overcomplicate your game. Ability options. The optional rules in this section pertain to using ability scores. This optional rule replaces a character's proficiency bonus with a proficiency die, adding more randomness to the game and making proficiency a less reliable indicator of mastery. Instead of adding a proficiency bonus to an ability check, an attack roll or saving throw, the player character rolls a die. The proficiency die table shows which die or dice to roll, as determined by the character's level. Whenever a feature such as a rogue's expertise lets a character double his or her proficiency bonus, the player rolls the character's proficiency die twice instead of once. This option is intended for player characters and non-player characters who have levels as opposed to monsters who don't. Skill variants. A skill dictates the circumstances under which a character can add his or her proficiency bonus to an ability check. Skills define those circumstances by referring to different aspects of the 6 ability scores. For example, acrobatics and stealth are 2 different aspects of dexterity, and a character can specialise in either or both. You can dispense with skills and use one of the following variants. Choose whichever one best suits your campaign. Ability check proficiency. With this variant rule, characters don't have skill proficiencies. Instead, each character has proficiency in 2 abilities, one tied to the character's class and one tied to the character's background. The ability proficiencies by class table suggests a proficiency for each class, and you choose which ability is tied to a given background. Starting at first level, a character adds his or her proficiency bonus to any ability check tied to one or the other of these 2 abilities. The expertise feature works differently than normal under this rule. At first level, instead of choosing 2 skill proficiencies, a character with the expertise class feature chooses one of the abilities in which he or she has proficiency, and selecting an ability counts as 2 of the character's expertise choices. If the character would gain an additional skill proficiency, that character instead selects another ability check in which to gain proficiency. This option removes skills from the game and doesn't allow for much distinction among characters. For example, a character can't choose to emphasise persuasion or intimidation. He or she is equally adept at both. Background proficiency. With this variant rule, characters don't have skill or tool proficiencies. Anything that would grant the character a skill or tool proficiency provides no benefit. Instead, a character can add his or her proficiency bonus to any ability check to which the character's prior training and experience, reflected in the character's background, reasonably applies. The DM is the ultimate judge of whether the character's background applies. For example, the player of a character with the noble background could reasonably argue that the proficiency bonus should apply to a charisma check that the character makes to secure an audience with the king. The player should be encouraged to explain in specific terms how the character's background applies, not simply, I'm a noble, but I spent 3 years before starting my adventuring career serving as my father's ambassador to the court, and this sort of thing is second nature to me now. This simple system relies heavily on players developing their characters' histories. Don't let it result in endless debates about whether a character's proficiency bonus applies in a given situation. Unless a player's attempt to explain the relevance of the character's background makes everybody else at the table roll their eyes at its absurdity, go ahead and reward the player for making the effort. If a character has the expertise feature, instead of choosing skills and tools to gain the benefit of that feature, the player defines aspects of his or her background to which the benefit applies. Continuing the noble example, the player might decide to apply expertise to situations where courtly manners and etiquette are paramount, and figuring out the secret plots that the court members hatch against one another. Personality trait proficiency. With this variant rule, characters don't have skill proficiencies. Instead, a character can add his or her proficiency bonus to any ability check directly related to the character's positive personality traits. For example, a character with a positive personality trait of, I never have a plan, but I'm great at making things up as I go along, might apply the bonus when engaging in some off-the-cuff deception to get out of a tight spot. A player should come up with at least 4 positive personality traits when creating a character. When a character's negative personality trait directly impacts an ability check, the character has disadvantage on the check. For example, a hermit whose negative trait is, I often get lost in my own thoughts and contemplation, oblivious to my surroundings, might have disadvantage on ability check made to notice creatures sneaking up. If a character has the expertise feature, the player can apply its benefit to personality traits related to ability checks instead of to skills or tools. If a character would gain a new skill or tool proficiency, the character instead gains a new positive personality trait. This system relies heavily on players developing their characters' personalities. Make sure that different characters' traits, positive and negative, come into play with about the same frequency. Don't let a player get away with a positive trait that always seems to apply and a negative trait that never does. At your discretion, you can also tie a character's ideals, bonds and flaws to this system. So I'm aware that might not be super useful if you don't run D&D. I think some of the principles could be applied to other games. I have found that these variant rules contained in Chapter 9 of the DMG often get overlooked, and I'd like to talk about them and explore them a little bit more, think about ways they might be useful to me personally in this old school, new school fusion, and I hope you'll join me again for further explorations. And that, as they say, is a wrap. Big thanks goes out to you, the listener, for taking a bit of time out of your day to listen to Old Spike Pit. Take care, and I'll catch you later.